What happens when a single piece of inherited jewelry becomes the thread that unravels a web of lies spanning 4 decades? What if the woman grinding espresso beans for minimum wage was actually the missing heir to a dynasty built on secrets that powerful people would kill to protect? For Mandy Walsh, a 24-year-old barista struggling to pay her grandmother's medical bills in the college town of Burlington, Vermont, that moment of recognition came on a frigid December morning when she served a cappuccino to a woman whose antique bracelet would unlock a family mystery that had been buried for 28 years. But one snow-swept winter day, a glittering platinum charm would melt away the lies that had frozen her past in silence. The morning rush at Grind Coffee House was in full swing when the black Mercedes SUV pulled up outside, its tinted windows reflecting the frost-covered storefronts of Church Street. Amanda Walsh barely looked up from the espresso machine as she steamed milk for what felt like the 100th latte of the day. At 24, she'd been working the opening shift for 3 years, arriving at 5 a.m. to prep the shop before the University of Vermont students and downtown professionals descended like caffeinated locusts. The bell above the door chimed as a woman entered, bringing with her a gust of Arctic air and an aura of understated wealth. She was probably in her 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of expensive winter coat that whispered old money rather than shouting new fortune. Her movements were precise, calculated, as if every gesture had been choreographed by generations of breeding and privilege. "Good morning," Mandy said with her practiced smile, wiping her hands on her apron. "What can I get started for you?" The woman approached the counter with the measured pace of someone accustomed to being waited on. "A cappuccino, please. Extra hot, no foam art." Her voice carried the crisp consonants of expensive education, tinged with a slight accent that suggested East Coast boarding schools and Ivy League universities. "Coming right up," Mandy replied, reaching for a clean cup. As the woman reached into her purse for her wallet, her sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing an exquisite vintage bracelet that made Mandy's breath catch in her throat. It was platinum, clearly antique, with 7 delicate charms dangling from its links. Each charm was a tiny masterpiece, a miniature sailboat, a crescent moon, a small book, a musical note, a butterfly, a star, and at the center, a heart with something glittering inside it. But what stopped Mandy cold wasn't the obvious craftsmanship or expense. It was the recognition. She'd seen that exact bracelet before, not in person, but in the faded photograph her grandmother Eleanor kept on her bedside table. In that picture, a young woman with Mandy's eyes and smile wore an identical bracelet, each charm catching the sunlight as she laughed at something outside the frame. "Excuse me," Mandy heard herself saying, her voice barely above a whisper. "That bracelet, it's beautiful. Is it a family piece?" The woman's hand instinctively moved to cover the jewelry, her blue eyes sharpening as they focused on Mandy's face with sudden intensity. "Yes, it's been in my family for generations. Why do you ask?" Mandy's heart hammered against her ribs. "My grandmother has a photograph of someone wearing the same bracelet. I've never seen another one like it." The woman's expression shifted from polite interest to something colder, more guarded. "That's highly unlikely. This piece was custom-made by Cartier in 1955. The design is unique to my family." "But there has to be another one," Mandy insisted, desperation creeping into her voice. "The woman in the photograph, she looks just like me. My grandmother said she was my mother." The woman studied Mandy's face with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "What's your name?" "Amanda Walsh, but my grandmother calls me Mandy." Something flickered across the woman's features, recognition, fear, or perhaps calculation. She reached into her purse and withdrew a slim leather wallet, extracting 3 crisp $50 bills and placing them on the counter. "Keep the change," she said, abandoning her unclaimed cappuccino. "And Miss Walsh, I'd be very careful about chasing family resemblances. Sometimes the past is better left undisturbed. As she moved toward the door, Mandy found her voice. "Wait! What's your name?" The woman paused at the threshold, her hand on the glass door. When she turned back, her expression was unreadable. "Victoria Ashworth," she said. "And if you're smart, you'll forget this conversation ever happened." The door closed behind her with a chime that sounded like a warning bell, leaving Mandy standing behind the counter with the echo of her words and a growing certainty that her carefully ordered world was about to explode. Mandy couldn't concentrate for the rest of her shift. The name Ashworth echoed in her mind, familiar yet elusive, like a half-remembered dream. She'd heard it before, whispered in the corridors of the nursing home where her grandmother Eleanor lived, spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear by the older residents who remembered when names like Ashworth still carried weight in Vermont society. After closing the shop, Mandy drove through the snowy streets to Sunset Manor, the assisted living facility where Eleanor had lived for the past 2 years. The move had been heartbreaking but necessary. Eleanor's dementia was progressing, and Mandy couldn't afford private care on a barista's wages. She found Eleanor in the common room, staring out at the snow-covered gardens with the distant expression that had become increasingly frequent. At 79, she was still beautiful, but the sharp intelligence that had once made her a formidable high school principal was fading like smoke. "Hi, Grandma," Mandy said softly, settling into the chair beside her. Eleanor's face brightened with recognition. "Mandy, sweetheart, what brings you here so early? I wanted to ask you about something, about the photograph in your room, one of the woman with the bracelet." A shadow crossed Eleanor's features. Her hands, spotted with age but still elegant, began to tremble slightly. "Which photograph, dear?" "You know which one, Grandma. The woman who looks like me. You always said she was my mother, but you never told me her name." Eleanor's gaze drifted back to the window, and for a moment Mandy thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Her name was Amanda Ashworth." The confirmation hit Mandy like a physical blow. Ashworth. "Grandma, a woman named Victoria Ashworth came into the coffee shop today. She was wearing the same bracelet." Eleanor's head snapped around, her eyes suddenly sharp and focused. "Victoria? After all these years? You know her? She was your mother's sister." Eleanor's grip tightened on the arms of her chair. "Mandy, you have to stay away from that family. They're dangerous." "What do you mean, dangerous?" "Grandma, what happened to my mother?" Eleanor struggled to stand, her movements urgent despite her frailty. "Come to my room. There are things I need to show you before I forget them completely." Eleanor's room was small but comfortable, filled with photographs and mementos from her teaching career. But it was the locked jewelry box on her dresser that drew Mandy's attention. With shaking hands, Eleanor retrieved a small key from beneath her mattress and opened the box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a collection of items that told a story Mandy had never heard. There were letters tied with blue ribbon, official-looking documents, and at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, a single charm, a platinum heart identical to the one on Victoria Ashworth's bracelet. "Your mother gave me this the night she brought you to me," Eleanor said, holding up the charm. "You were only 6 months old. She said it was proof of who you were, proof of your birthright." Mandy stared at the tiny heart, noticing for the first time that it opened like a locket. Inside was a miniature photograph, a man and woman holding a baby. "That's your father," Eleanor said, pointing to the man in the photo. "James Crawford. He was a good man, a journalist who was investigating the Ashworth family's business practices." "What kind of business practices?" Eleanor's expression grew. "Grim. The Ashworths made their fortune in pharmaceuticals and medical devices, but in the 1970s and 80s they were cutting corners, falsifying safety data, bribing FDA officials. James was going to expose them. What happened to him? He died in a car accident 3 weeks before you were born. But your mother didn't believe it was an accident. She said the Ashworths had too much to lose if his story went public. Mandy, he felt the world spinning around her. And my mother. Amanda was supposed to inherit a significant portion of the family fortune when she turned 25. But after James died, she became convinced her own family was responsible. She was terrified they'd kill her and you to prevent her from going public with James's research. Eleanor pulled out one of the letters, its edges yellowed with age. She wrote this the night before she died. She said she was going to confront her father, demand the truth about James's death. She never came back. How did she die? Officially, suicide. They said she threw herself off the Champlain Bridge. But Amanda wasn't suicidal, Mandy. She was a fighter. She would never have left you voluntarily. The revelation was staggering. Mandy's entire life had been built on a carefully constructed lie. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. She'd been murdered for trying to expose her own family's crimes. Why didn't you ever tell me this? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Because I was scared. The Ashworths are one of the most powerful families in New England. I thought if you didn't know who you were, they'd leave you alone. But now Victoria knows I exist. Yes, Eleanor, said her voice heavy with dread, and that means you're in terrible danger. That night, Mandy sat in her studio apartment above the coffee shop, surrounded by the documents Eleanor had given her. There were birth certificates, medical records, financial statements, all proving that she was Amanda Catherine Ashworth. Crawford, the daughter of Amanda Ashworth and James Crawford, and the rightful heir to a fortune that had been stolen from her. But the most damning evidence was in James Crawford's research files, which Eleanor had somehow preserved. Page after page documented the Ashworth family's systematic corruption of the pharmaceutical approval process, their willingness to market drugs they knew were dangerous, their cover-up of side effects that had killed dozens of patients. As she read, Mandy began to understand why her parents had died. James Crawford hadn't just been investigating corporate malfeasance. He'd uncovered evidence of mass murder disguised as legitimate business. The phone rang, jolting her from her reading. She hesitated before answering, wondering if Victoria Ashworth had somehow tracked down her number. "Hello? Miss Walsh, this is Dr. Patricia Morgan from Sunset Manor. I'm afraid there's been an incident with your grandmother." Mandy's blood turned to ice. What kind of incident? "She was found unconscious in her room this evening. We've called an ambulance, but you should come quickly." The drive to the hospital was a blur of snow and panic. Mandy arrived to find Eleanor in intensive care, connected to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical urgency. Dr. Morgan met her in the hallway, her expression grave. "What happened?" Mandy demanded. "We're not entirely sure. It appears to be some kind of poisoning, but the symptoms are unusual. We're running tests, but her condition is critical." Mandy felt the room spinning. "Poisoning? How is that possible?" "The nurse found an empty teacup in her room. We're testing the contents, but—" Dr. Morgan hesitated. "Miss Walsh, has your grandmother made any enemies recently? Anyone who might want to hurt her?" Mandy thought about Victoria Ashworth's warning, about the dangerous family her grandmother had spent decades hiding from. "I need to call the police." But even as she said it, Mandy wondered if the police could be trusted. The Ashworths had been buying influence for generations. How deep did their corruption reach? As she sat beside Eleanor's bed, watching the machines that kept her grandmother alive, Mandy made a decision. She was tired of hiding, tired of running from a past she'd never even known existed. If the Ashworths wanted a fight, she would give them one. But first, she needed allies, and according to her mother's letters, there was one person who might still be willing to help if he was still alive after all these years. The next morning, despite having no sleep and despite the coffee shop being short-staffed, Mandy called, in sick for the first time in 3 years. Instead, she drove to the University of Vermont Library and spent hours researching everything she could find about investigative journalist Michael Turner, who, according to her mother's notes, had been James Crawford's research partner. What she found gave her hope. Turner was still alive, still working as an investigative reporter, now at the Burlington Free Press. According to his bio, he'd spent 30 years exposing corporate corruption and government malfeasance. More importantly, he'd written several articles about pharmaceutical industry corruption in the 1990s, articles that skirted dangerously close to naming the Ashworth family directly. She found his office number and called from a payphone outside the library. "Turner. Mr. Turner, my name is Amanda Walsh. I think you knew my father, James Crawford." There was a long pause on the other end. When Turner spoke again, his voice had changed completely. "Jesus Christ, after all these years, are you safe?" "I don't know. Someone poisoned my grandmother last night. I think it's because I made contact with the Ashworth family yesterday." "Where are you?" "The University Library." "Stay there. I'll be there in 20 minutes. And Amanda, trust no one else. If you're calling me, it means they know you're alive." Michael Turner was a weathered man in his 60s, with graying hair and the haunted eyes of someone who'd spent his career staring into the abyss of human greed. He found Mandy in the library's reference section and immediately guided her to a secluded corner where they couldn't be overheard. "Show me what you have," he said without preamble. Mandy pulled out copies of her father's research files. Turner's expression grew increasingly grim as he reviewed the documents. "My God," he whispered, "James actually managed to save this stuff. We thought it was all destroyed when he died." "You were working with him." "James was my best friend and research partner. We'd been investigating Ashworth Pharmaceuticals for 2 years when he met your mother. She was the key to everything. As a family member, she had access to internal documents we could never have obtained legally." Turner pulled out his phone and showed Mandy a photograph from the 1990s, a younger version of himself standing with a man who looked remarkably like Mandy and a pregnant woman with kind eyes. "This was taken a week before James died," Turner explained. "Your parents had finally gathered enough evidence to bring criminal charges against the entire Ashworth Board of Directors." "What happened?" "Richard Ashworth, Victoria's father, and your grandfather found out about the investigation. He had James killed first, made it look like a drunk driving accident. But your mother escaped with you and our evidence files. And then they killed her too." Turner nodded grimly. "The suicide was staged. Richard never intended to let either of you live, but your mother was smarter than he gave her credit for. She made copies of everything and hid them with your grandmother before she went to confront him. So there's still evidence that could bring them down, if we can find it. Your mother told me she'd hidden the original files somewhere safe, but she never got the chance to tell me where." Mandy thought about the charm Eleanor had given her, about the tiny photograph inside. What if she did tell someone? What if she left clues? That afternoon, they returned to Sunset Manor together. Eleanor was conscious, but weak, the poison having damaged her kidneys and liver. But when she saw Turner, her eyes brightened with recognition. "Michael, my God, is that really you? Hello, Eleanor, it's been too long." She knows, doesn't she? Amanda knows the truth about her parents. Turner took Eleanor's hand gently. "Eleanor, we need your help. Amanda's mother hid evidence that could finally bring down the Ashworths, but we don't know where. Did she give you any clues?" Eleanor's brow furrowed in concentration. "She said something about 7 promises that would keep Amanda safe until she was old enough to claim her inheritance." Mandy pulled out the charm, opening it to reveal the tiny photograph. Grandma, what did she mean by 7 promises? Eleanor stared at the charm, her eyes suddenly focusing with startling clarity. The bracelet. She said each charm represented a promise, a piece of the puzzle that would make sense when Amanda was old enough to understand. What kind of promises? I don't remember all of them, but I remember one. The book charm represented knowledge, the truth about what really happened. And the sailboat, she said that represented a journey, something about crossing water to reach safety. Turner leaned forward intently. Eleanor, this is important. Do you remember anything else about where she might have hidden the evidence? Eleanor closed her eyes, struggling to summon memories that dementia was slowly stealing away. She said something about the place where she and James first met, where their love story began. She said that's where their daughter would find the truth. Where did they meet? Mandy asked. At the Burlington waterfront. James was covering a story about lake pollution, and Amanda was there protesting her own family's chemical dumping. They fell in love while fighting for the same cause. Turner and Mandy exchanged glances. The waterfront was a large area, but it was a start. There's something else, Eleanor continued, her voice growing weaker. She said when Amanda found the truth, she should look for the guardian. Someone who'd been watching over her, protecting her from a distance. The guardian? Someone James trusted, someone who'd promised to help when the time came. As Eleanor drifted off to sleep, Turner pulled Mandy aside. We need to search the waterfront, but we have to be careful. If Victoria Ashworth knows you're alive, her family will be watching you. Then let them watch, Mandy said, her voice hardening with resolve. I'm tired of hiding from people who murdered my parents. The next morning brought news that made Mandy's blood boil. Eleanor had died during the night, her organs finally succumbing to the poison that had been meant for Mandy. The official cause of death was listed as complications from advanced dementia, but Mandy knew better. The Ashworths had murdered the only family she'd ever known, just to send a message. Standing in the hospital hallway, clutching the plastic bag containing Eleanor's personal effects, Mandy made a vow. She would find her mother's evidence, expose the Ashworth family's crimes, and make them pay for every life they'd destroyed. But first, she had to survive long enough to keep her promise. The Burlington waterfront in winter was a desolate place, the lake frozen solid and the tourist attractions shuttered until spring. Turner had arranged to meet Mandy at the community boathouse, reasoning that if Amanda Ashworth had hidden evidence somewhere along the waterfront, it would be in a place with year-round access. They searched for hours, following the charm clues as best they could interpret them. The sailboat charm led them to the marina, the star to the planetarium, the musical note to the Flynn Center. But it was the butterfly charm that finally provided the breakthrough. The butterfly garden, Turner said suddenly. There's a small memorial garden near the bike path, dedicated to environmental activists. Your parents used to meet there. They found the garden easily enough. A small, carefully maintained space with native plants and a bronze plaque honoring those who gave their lives protecting Lake Champlain. But it was the bench facing the lake that caught Mandy's attention. Carved into its wooden surface, almost worn away by decades of weather, were 7 small symbols: a sailboat, a moon, a book, a musical note, a butterfly, a star, and a heart. This is it, Mandy breathed. This is where she left the message. Turner examined the bench carefully, running his fingers along the carved symbols. There, he said, pointing to a small metal plate beneath the heart symbol. That's not original to the bench. The plate was secured with screws that had clearly been added later. Using a multi-tool, Turner carefully removed it to reveal a small, waterproof container hidden in the hollow beneath. Inside was a single key and a piece of paper with an address, a storage unit facility across town. Your mother thought of everything, Turner said admiringly. She used the charm bracelet as a treasure map, leading you here when you were old enough to understand. The storage unit was small and climate-controlled, paid for by an automatic trust fund that had been transferring money for 24 years. Inside, they found Amanda Ashworth's complete investigation files, financial records documenting decades of pharmaceutical fraud, recorded conversations revealing bribery and cover-ups, FDA approval documents that had been falsified, and clinical trial data that proved the Ashworths had knowingly marketed drugs that killed patients. But the most damning evidence was a video recording made just days before Amanda's death. In it, she sat in what appeared to be this very storage unit, looking directly into the camera. "If you're watching this," Amanda said, her voice steady, despite the fear in her eyes, "it means my father succeeded in killing me and James, but it also means our daughter survived, and she's old enough to learn the truth about her family." She held up the platinum heart charm, its surface catching the light. "Mandy, I want you to know that you were conceived in love and born into hope. Your father tried to stop my family from poisoning innocent people for profit. When peaceful methods failed, we chose justice over silence." The video continued for another hour, detailing evidence and providing context for the medical documents. By the end, Mandy was crying, not just for the parents she'd never known, but for all the victims of her family's greed. "What do we do now?" she asked Turner. "We finish what your parents started," he replied grimly, "but we have to move fast. The Ashworths know you're getting close to the truth." As if summoned by their words, Turner's phone rang. He answered it with a frown that quickly turned to alarm. "What? When? Christ, we'll be right there." He hung up and turned to Mandy, his face ashen. "That was my editor. The coffee shop where you work. It burned down an hour ago. They're calling it an electrical fire, but—" Mandy felt her world collapse. The Ashworths weren't just trying to silence her. They were destroying everything she cared about, everyone who might help her. "This ends now," she said, her voice hardening with resolve. "I'm done running, done hiding. It's time for the truth to come out." The annual Ashworth Foundation Medical Research Gala was Vermont's premier charity event, attracting doctors, researchers, and politicians from across New England. The irony of the family receiving awards for medical advancement wasn't lost on Mandy as she planned her confrontation. Working with Turner, she'd spent weeks preparing. They'd made copies of all the evidence and distributed them to journalists, FDA investigators, and federal prosecutors across multiple states. But Mandy wanted more than just justice. She wanted the Ashworths to face their crimes in front of the people who'd enabled them for decades. The gala was held in the Grand Ballroom of the Sheraton Burlington, a glittering showcase of Vermont high society. Mandy arrived wearing a simple black dress she'd borrowed from a thrift store, her mother's platinum heart charm prominently displayed at her throat. She looked nothing like the society debutantes who filled the room, but she carried herself with inherited grace and newfound purpose. She made her way through the crowd, ignoring the curious stares and whispered comments. At the center of it all stood Victoria Ashworth, beside an elderly man who could only be Richard Ashworth, Mandy's grandfather and the architect of her parents' murders. Their eyes met across the ballroom, and Mandy saw the exact moment when recognition dawned in Victoria's face. The older woman's hand flew to her throat, her face going pale as she whispered something to her father. Richard Ashworth turned, his cold blue eyes scanning the crowd until they found Mandy. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then he smiled, a predatory expression that sent chills down Mandy's spine. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, tapping his champagne flute to call for attention, "I'd like to introduce someone very special who's joined us tonight. My granddaughter Amanda, who's been away from the family for far too long." The room fell silent. Mandy had planned to make a dramatic entrance to expose them before they could react. Instead, Richard had turned the tables, presenting her as a beloved family member trying to control the narrative. "Hello, grandfather," Mandy said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "Thank you for finally acknowledging that I exist." "Of course, my dear," Richard replied smoothly. "Family is everything to the Ashworths. We've been heartbroken by your absence. Heartbroken enough to murder my parents when they tried to expose your crimes." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Richard's mask of grandfatherly affection never slipped. "I'm afraid grief and confusion have affected my poor granddaughter," he said, his voice full of practiced sympathy. "Losing one's parents at such a young age, growing up without family support, it can create unfortunate delusions." "Delusions backed up by 24 years of evidence," Mandy shot back, pulling out a small remote control. "Evidence my parents died trying to preserve." She pressed a button, and every screen in the ballroom, meant to display photos of the Foundation's medical research, lit up with images from her parents' hidden files. FDA approval documents with falsified data, recorded conversations about bribing officials, clinical trial results showing deadly side effects that had been covered up. The crowd watched in horrified silence as Richard Ashworth's voice filled the room, casually discussing how to suppress evidence of drugs that were killing patients. "These files contain everything," Mandy announced. 24 years of medical fraud, bribery, and murder, all orchestrated by the man you're honoring tonight, the same man who killed my parents and tried to kill me." Richard's composure finally cracked. The grandfatherly facade fell away, revealing the cold-blooded killer beneath. "Enough," he snarled, lunging toward Mandy. But he never reached her. FBI agents poured into the ballroom from every entrance, led by Agent Sarah Matthews, who'd been building a pharmaceutical fraud case against Ashworth Industries for 10 years. "Richard Ashworth," Agent Matthews announced, her badge glinting. "Under the crystal chandeliers, you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, pharmaceutical fraud, and approximately 90 other federal charges." As they led him away in handcuffs, Richard turned back to Mandy, his eyes blazing with decades of suppressed hatred. "You think this ends it?" he called out. "You think you've won? I have lawyers, judges, half the FDA in my pocket. I'll be free in a week, and you'll be dead in 2. "Maybe," Mandy replied calmly, "but everyone here tonight knows the truth now. And tomorrow, the whole world will see what the Ashworth name really represents." She touched the heart charm at her throat, its platinum surface warm against her skin. "This was supposed to be my inheritance, grandfather, but I'm returning it to the victims your family poisoned, along with every penny of your blood money." The trials took 7 years, but justice ultimately prevailed. Richard and Victoria Ashworth were convicted on over 100 federal charges and sentenced to life in prison without parole. They died behind bars within months of each other, their pharmaceutical empire dismantled and their assets seized to compensate the families of their victims. Mandy inherited what remained of her parents' estate, a substantial sum that had been held in trust for decades. But she used every penny to honor their memory, establishing the James Crawford and Amanda Ashworth Foundation for Medical Ethics, dedicated to exposing pharmaceutical fraud and ensuring drug safety. She rebuilt Grind Coffee House, but transformed it into something more, a community center that provided free coffee and internet access to students and activists working to expose corporate corruption. On the day marking the 5th anniversary of her grandparents' conviction, Mandy stood on the Burlington waterfront, where her parents had first met, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson. Michael Turner found her there, looking out over water that sparkled in the fading light. "Any regrets?" he asked. Mandy touched the simple silver chain at her throat. She'd replaced the elaborate charm bracelet with her father's press badge. The only other personal item the storage unit had contained. "None," she said firmly. "My parents died trying to protect innocent people from my family's greed. Eleanor died protecting me. I won't let their sacrifices be meaningless." "And what about your future? You could go anywhere now, do anything." Mandy smiled, watching a couple walk hand in hand along the same path where her parents had fallen in love. "I know exactly what I want to do. I want to make sure no other families are destroyed by corporate greed, and I want to make sure no other child grows up not knowing their parents died as heroes." "Your parents would be proud," Turner said softly. "All three of them would," Mandy agreed. "And that's enough." Amanda's transformation from struggling barista to crusader for medical ethics proves that truth, no matter how deeply buried beneath. Decades of lies and cover-ups has a power that no amount of wealth or influence can suppress. Her story reminds us that heroes don't always emerge from places of privilege. Sometimes they rise from coffee shops and nursing homes, armed with nothing but courage and the determination to honor those who came before. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, but the strength to fight for justice and the wisdom to transform pain into purpose. Amanda Walsh became Amanda Ashworth Crawford, not to claim a fortune, but to reclaim her family's honor and ensure that their fight for medical ethics would continue for generations to come. If this story of courage triumphing over corruption moved you, please share it with someone who believes in the power of medical ethics and corporate accountability. What would you have done in Mandy's place? Stayed hidden and safe, or risked everything to expose the truth about your family's crimes? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that prove justice may be delayed, but it's never truly denied.